Thank you very much for the invitation, and really happy to be here. Just for my own information, how many people here have actually utilized Vetiver in their farming systems and in their work? And you show, wow, that's a really good number of people. So I'll also then beg your indulgence when I go over ground that you're really familiar with already, but I hope I don't bore you. So what I want to talk to you about today is why we think the Vetiver system can be a good toolkit for community-led climate change adaptation. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a history of the system, a bit of an overview of where it came from, who we are as TVNI and what it is that we do, because we would really like, if you're interested, we really want to support you any way that you can, or any way that we can. So let's get started here today and put up my first slide. There we go. Climate change adaptation in the Global South. Why the Global South? Really, our interest in Vetiver started with trying to reach smallholder farmers, and most particularly rain-fed smallholder farmers. They're the poorest of the poor. They're the most marginalized. They're the ones that need the greatest support to increase the productivity and sustainability and resilience of their systems. And they're on the front lines of climate change in most parts of the world, particularly in uplands. So climate change, where is that going? As I'm sure all of you are aware, the world sort of agreed on a 1.5 degrees centigrade target to not exceed by 2100. And we're well on track to exceed that in this decade. And worst case scenarios for 2100 are extremely frightening in terms of increase in temperature. So right now at the COP27, there's a lot of focus on discussion of climate change adaptation, and there's going to be a lot of discussion to try to raise more finance to help developing countries cope with climate events, shall we say, the extreme weather events that are already impacting the communities and the farmers that we work with. Well, interestingly, there was a review article done looking at hundreds of climate change adaptation programs around the world, particularly in the Global South. And what they found was that it's really not governments and government programs and international institutions that are delivering the majority of the action. It's coming directly from the farmers and the farming households themselves. Yet the impact, the efficiency and effectiveness of what they're doing is limited because they lack certain things. And the things that they lack are things that government and these programs should be bringing, which is a focus on implementation, doing something on the ground, not talking about it, capacity building, knowledge, information. It needs capital. And the thing I found personally most off-putting when I read this was the quote that the bureaucratized approaches prioritizing governmental actors who are meant to act on behalf of vulnerable populations. I've been in development programs for 40 years, and we learned a long time ago, you don't do things on behalf of local populations. You empower people to do them themselves. And so in this case, I worry about how effective an increased attention to adaptation is going to be if we continue with business as usual scenarios of delivering it. So if public sector programs are not delivering on climate change adaptation, should we support them so that they can? I think that's a mistake as well. The scale of the problem is simply too big. There's billions of poor living on the frontiers of climate change. There's more than 240 or 120 million rain-fed smallholder households in India and sub-Saharan Africa alone. And if you look at about 2.5 million Pacific Islanders who are really in dire straits with sea level rise, issues with water availability, they're scattered across 15% of the Earth's surface in many small populations that systematic programs will never reach. So based on our experience with Vetiver and its long development, we think it offers the type of toolkit that can be managed by communities. It obviously requires a systematic effort, but it really is through end users such as yourselves that we think that can be delivered, because there's a huge network out there of people working on these issues. And if we can get them interested and support them with information and anything else we can support with, we think that there's at least a possibility to help many people that otherwise won't be helped. So what is the Vetiver Toolkit? The Vetiver Toolkit is essentially the Vetiver System. The Vetiver System has a range of proven applications and proven impacts. And if we look at those versus what are the climate change impact pathways, the Vetiver System can be really quite relevant in building resilience and ameliorating and helping to mitigate some of these impacts. There's no mitigation of all of them, and if the world continues on its current path, even Vetiver's not going to help. Now, when I say proven, I think because that's important. We all know you don't put farmers at risk. You don't put the poor at risk. You don't try to sell them something that you're not sure if it works or not, and use them as a laboratory to prove your case. Well, I say the Vetiver System is proven because there's literally decades with tens of thousands of end users that have shown that these applications work. So we've got this vast, really weighty body of anecdotal and empirical evidence. But it has been that anecdotal and empirical evidence that has also caught the attention of researchers, academics, and technicians around the world. So a couple years ago, I did a meta-analysis to sort of look at who's publishing, what sort of research is out there. And if you look, you can see that in the last 20 years, there has really been a very large increase in the attention and in the depth and the breadth of the research that has being done on the Vetiver Toolkit. So I feel that between the anecdotal, the end user experiences, and we now have got the research backing on it, that we've got a pretty solid basis to know where it works, under what conditions it works, and what you can expect from it. And we'd like to have more cost data, but no one likes to report cost data. So where does the Vetiver System come from? What's its origin story? Well, I was very excited to run across this quote some years back. 9 centuries ago, people were using hedgerows for soil conservation. In Isaiah 5:1-7, we've got a hillside farmer that if he tears out his hedge, his field's going to be eaten up. And if we jump forward 9 centuries in one bound, we're now in India in the mid-1980s, where the World Bank is financing a large program of what was called watershed management, primarily in the semi-arid portions of India. I don't think I'm going to need my notes. Seem to be doing okay so far. That program was a failure, and it was an expensive failure. Engineered structures they generate a lot of money for designers and for construction companies and operators, but the farmers did not want them, the farmers did not like them. Amongst others, they had to cross field boundaries in order to be functional, and if one farmer didn't maintain their portion, it could damage someone downstream or even upstream. They disliked the bunds so much they'd plow straight through them if they could. And but we kept building them because the engineers and the construction companies were still out there. But Dick Grimshaw, who was the Ag Division chief in India, decided that had to stop wasting money that way. And he tasked John Greenfield, who was his lead agronomist, to come up with a more farmer-friendly alternative. John, in a small village in Karnataka state, Gundalpet, found that farmers had a long tradition of planting vetiver on their field boundaries, and that in result, even though the slopes were only 1 or 2%, that area looked like the fields had been laser leveled. They were just dead flat, and there was still, quite a riser between the two fields. Now, the farmers were not planting it because they wanted soil conservation. They're planting it because vetiver's deep root system made it the last green pick into these 9-month dry seasons, and so they were planting it for fodder production. Small farmers that had no animals didn't plant it on their boundaries, only farmers that had livestock. So, and the permanence of those field boundaries was such that the survey department actually was accepting them as permanent boundary markers for the official survey. So when John and Dick started looking into vetiver, they found that really vetiver was very widely known throughout India in most communities because it had a long history of traditional uses in medicine, ceremonial, for weaving mats, oils, perfumes, etc. But the interesting thing is that the majority of these uses were associated with the roots of the plant. And over this millennia, there was both an intentional and an unintentional selection of planting material that would produce roots and those gains would be consolidated through clonal production until over time, like sugarcane, you ended up with cultivars of vetiver that had very massive root systems, but that could not be propagated by seed. They did not set viable seed. So John realized that he knew vetiver. He had planted it in Fiji in the 1950s when he worked for the sugar companies there, and they were moving their production up onto the hillsides. And they tasked John with coming up with a system to sustain production on hillsides of soil and moisture conservation. So I'm going to let John tell you about that himself.
When I was sent over to Fiji we were going to move the sugar industry up into the hills, and the object was to get this to use the American system of soil conservation. Yeah. That's contour banks, absorption banks, diversion banks, all that sort of thing, leading to grass waterways, or leading to dams. And that was the accepted system of soil conservation. Well, when I got to Fiji, where we were going to do this for the sugar company, I realized that here we are in the tropics, and this isn't 600 to 800 millimeters rainfall. This is over 2,000 millimeters rainfall. How are these contour banks going to withstand the tremendous the heavy rainfalls and the heavy rainfall episodes we get in the tropics? They won't be able to do it. So what I thought if we could only find a vegetative system that would take over from those banks, we'd be better off using that. So what I did was I planted about 20 different plants as vegetative hedges to see what effect they would have, and vetiver grass just happened to be one of them. And then we had this massive storm of 500 millimeters fell in 3 hours, and the only plant that withstood it was vetiver grass. And I thought, well, that's it. It selected itself, and we never looked back. We used vetiver grass from then on. All our vetiver grass in Fiji was planted from slips. Mm-hmm. And we covered 400,000 acres of sugar fields with vetiver hedges. And we didn't get any erosion, we didn't have any problems, and being a rain-fed, this is rain-fed sugar, we had good yields, good sugar.
So when John went back, a lot of the farmers there that knew vetiver and vetiver hedgerows, if you see that terrace, that's a good almost 10-foot riser that's developed behind there. And this was 30 years later. Those hedges were still there. The gully stabilization works were still there, were still functioning. And because there were a lot of Hindi-speaking farmers, he was able to do some videos of Hindi farmers explaining the vetiver system for hill slope agriculture that he took back to India with him. And so that's what kicked off the World Bank's involvement with vetiver, but it was really not the World Bank. It was two people, Dick Grimshaw and John Greenfield, who developed it and promoted it. And that led to the U.S. National Research Council's Board of Science Technology for International Development to decide that they wanted to conduct a scientific audit of vetiver grass. See if all of these assertions were true. They put together a panel of distinguished scientists led by the Nobel laureate Norman Borlaug. And I think the names of the other people on the panel will be familiar to many of you: Ratan Lal, David Pimentel, and Hugh Papineau. I was speaking with someone yesterday whose graduate advisor was Hugh Papineau, so I know people know him. And their conclusion was, well, vetiver's not just in India. It actually moved around the world. It's pan-tropical. It was moved by the Indian diaspora to Africa and Asia, Latin America, but it was also moved in the economic botany kit of many of the colonial powers. And so it ended up moving around with certain crops such as tea, coffee, and in Guatemala Highlands you'll find Germans were planting vetiver in their coffee plantations back in the 1920s to stabilize the field roads and also the buns. So they concluded that there was a body of evidence and experience that showed that it worked, but it was sort of a somewhat unique approach. When we say unique, what we're talking about are deep-rooted stiff grass hedges. There's not a lot of stiff grass, clump grasses. And so they said, go ahead, this works. So John was a very passionate promoter for the rest of his life of vetiver, and I'm going to let him tell you why it was important to him.
The vetiver system in the tropics is a gift from God. It really is. It's just the greatest thing that could ever have happened, because the people that we need to help are the farmers, the poor rain-fed farmer. And if he's got to buy a new hoe or a new piece of equipment to use as a means of getting a protection for his field from erosion or whatever it might be, he can't afford it, and he was not interested. The other thing is, how do you get those people interested? The best way is to tell them you've got a system that is going to increase their yields by 30%. Mm-hmm. And it's not going to cost them anything, and once they've got it established, they don't have to worry about it anymore. Getting it established might be a little bit of hard work, but after that they can forget about it. It's their system, and it will last them for generations.
So we miss John. So Dick Grimshaw, when he left the World Bank in 1994, founded the Vetiver Network because he knew that the World Bank would not continue to promote and work on the development of it. So he set up a nonprofit that's based here in the U.S. And so we've been operating since 1995. Currently, we've always been an all-volunteer network, which means when you come knocking on our door, we might not answer immediately because you can't force volunteers to do anything they don't want to, unfortunately. But we have built up a global network of partners. Our website is an authoritative repository of technical, educational, and promotional materials. Anything you want to know about vetiver, if it's out there, you'll find it through our website. Our chief technical guy just put up a publication with over 2,000 references and linked many of them. And we've had 6 international conferences, dozens of regional and national workshops, and we established an award program to incentivize research and development and to recognize successful efforts. Also, Thailand has been extremely important to the development and dissemination. The prior king, King Bhumipol, through the Royal Development Projects, was a very strong proponent of vetiver grass. And they have done at the community level, maybe could have do a better job through empowering communities to do more things themselves, but certainly also developing other applications for bioengineering, and particularly for phytoremediation of polluted lands and soils. The Thais have contributed tremendously. We've got a technical certification program, so you can apply for technical certification. We've got links to some 60 networks in over 50 countries. And there's a lot of interesting people in the network doing very innovative things that have the social media and Facebook pages, and encourage you to take a look at them. So what's special about vetiver versus other grasses and plants? I'm not going to go into all of this in detail, just point out that it has very broad environmental tolerances and also edaphic soil conditions. It's non-invasive. It's important that when you plant it, it stays where you plant it. It's resistant to most pests and diseases, habitat for beneficial insects. It handles very droughty conditions. It handles floods. I found vetiver on an island, a little bar in the Mekong River that had probably been underwater for 4 months, 5 months of the year, and when the Mekong dropped, it's still there and starts growing again. It tolerates fire, overgrazing. Say it's got this massive root system, and that massive root system is really good at cleaning up things like heavy metals and in breaking down contaminants. Obviously, it sequesters a lot of carbon. That's not something, I mean, we pay attention to that, but we're more interested in adaptation than mitigation. I personally am not a fan of the idea that the world's most poorest, most vulnerable people are going to sacrifice to reduce the carbon footprint of the rest of us. Anyway, so it works because of its aerial part, and it works because of its subterranean part. So it has a strong, stiff, dense, thick shoots that will bring runoff water to a stop and have sediments drop out. This was a 2-year-old hedge in Malaysia. Obviously, this is a humid zone, but you can see how in 2 years, how much sediment has accumulated behind that, and these natural terraces are forming. And I think this is, yeah, there we go. This was done by the USDA Agricultural Research Services Sedimentation Laboratory in Mississippi. They got really interested in this idea of stiff grass hedges and wanted to know how they worked. So they did these flume studies, which create some really remarkable visuals, and because they wanted to find cold weather analogs for a vetiver to use here in the United States. They ended up deciding that vetiver was sort of the baseline, was sort of the metric to compare other grasses against, and they found nothing else, no other clump grasses in at least our temperate parts, and we've got a really nice range of clump grasses in our prairie states and up into Canada. But nothing really had that same density of it. They eventually decided that switchgrass was probably about the closest thing you could get here in North America, but it requires a much wider hedge because it doesn't have that density. Okay, so we've got the deep roots that we like to refer to as living nails. They actually have a very, very high tensile strength that exceeds that of many tree species, much more than salix species, willows, which are commonly used for bioengineering, slope stabilization, and riparian areas. Another thing they do is clump grasses literally are conduits that channel rainfall runoff vertically into the soil, not just vetiver, all clump grasses. If you look at infiltration rates alongside them, and if you look at hydraulic conductivities down through their root profile, it's huge. They really are pipes down into the soil for deep soil moisture recharge. The other thing with this root system in particular is it will break down persistent organic pollutants. And the ties have found the 2 pathways that do that. One is in the rhizosphere with its symbiotes. The other is within the plant itself, that it will break down these complex organic molecules. What's the importance of that? Dioxin-contaminated soils. There has never been a way to treat dioxin-contaminated soils other than to scrape them up and landfill them. So only highly contaminated soils are treated. You can clean up lightly and moderately contaminated soils. Heavy metals, U.S. Housing and Urban Development Department right now is looking at vetiver for mitigating lead contamination around the footprint of older houses here in the United States where there's lead-based paints. So it's got these great possibilities for cleaning up water and cleaning up land, which, we worry about water scarcity with climate change, but if you actually look at the percentage of water that is so contaminated that it can't even be used, that's a huge percentage of the water supply. So we're worried that, assuming we had access to 100%, there's not enough. Well, drop out the 30 to 60% that's too polluted for human use in many parts of the world, and you're really in trouble. So those dense roots. So what can you do with the vetiver system? I'm going to go through this really quickly because it's way more complex and broad than I can possibly do justice to in the time that's here. But what I will say is that it has spread globally over the last 30 years by end users, people that have had problems. They're looking for a solution. They hear about vetiver, they give it a try, it works. They're the ones that have developed this broad range of uses. It has not been the research in the academic community. Because of the work done by end users, the research and academic communities got interested in vetiver and has started filling in now with research. But to me, this user-driven field-based development is kind of unique. And here you to have a traditional technology from one country that was moved around the world, people found those uses, and now that, I'm not saying that the Vetiver Network did this, but as communication and information exchange has taken place, we've seen an explosion in applications. So this is from our website. This is our menu, that the Vetiver System applications in agriculture, slope stabilization, contaminated land and water, disaster mitigation, and other uses. If you go to our website at www.vetiver.org, you'll find that menu and you'll find access to all the information, more information than you might be able to use. It can be a bit overwhelming. So in agriculture, in-field soil and moisture conservation, these pictures are from Ethiopia. Ethiopia is probably one of the countries that we know of. There's a lot going on that we don't know of. But in Ethiopia, there's been very substantial uptake of vetiver by hill slope farmers in many parts of the country. In this area alone, they figure about 20,000 farmers are using vetiver. Then through, and it doesn't have to be systematic. This sort of ad hoc use and insertion of vetiver into existing production systems is something that we're seeing increasingly. And I really recommend the website of this Vietnam Vetiver Farmers Group. So the guy that runs that, there are more interesting things coming up from farmers there that they're posting themselves, and very interesting innovations. The most recent one convinced me. They're actually planting vetiver right up against fruit trees for establishment and finding that they're getting better establishment, better growth, and better fruit production. I planted a few peach trees last year, and I'm testing that one out myself. For pest control, there's now literally hundreds of thousands of hectares in China, rice areas that's being used to help manage stem borers in rice, and also in South Africa and in Ethiopia in maize and sorghum with these particular stem borers. Vetiver functions as a dead-end trap crop. The borers like the vetiver more than they like the crop. They go lay their eggs in the flower culms. The larvae don't develop. They die in there. Or you can burn the hedge. And if you're worried that they're not going to die, just burn the hedge in the dry season. That'll take care of them. Host beneficial insects. There's some developing anecdotal information that under some conditions it works to deter nematodes, termites, and white flies, but the evidence is still a bit iffy on that. Vetiver is good as forage, which any of you that went to the tropical forage session yesterday, you saw Vetiver. It's not the highest protein, not the best, but regularly managed through cutting or grazing. The tender shoots provide a decent forage. Slope stabilization, particularly mountainous villages and things. This is a picture from Bali and a program there where in these remote communities they've managed to have all-weather roads throughout the rainy season there by stabilizing it with vetiver, or all-weather access. And slope stabilization with vetiver is 80 to 90% cheaper than it is with conventional engineered methods. You find these same things in India, in Africa. It's also utilized to stabilize home sites. Then we move to the contaminated land and water, and here's the latrine. This is one of my favorite innovations here that was developed by a gentleman in Haiti. And they successfully built several hundred of them, but before the money ran out. But I think they cost about $30 or $40 each, and that's mostly for the concrete cover on top of it. Also for village scale treatment of effluent from wet processing. Many of you are passionate about helping farmers do value-added production that requires agro-processing. Agro-processing contaminates water. What are you going to do with it? For the most part, I haven't seen in the programs I work with anybody have a good solution to that. These vetiver wetlands can be very effective for that. This is in Ethiopia, where village scale treatment, where you wash the coffee cherries. That effluent is a curse on coffee communities during the times of the year that wet processing is going on. Solid waste management, almost everywhere in the world right now, even in the smallest villages, all the garbage we generate, what do you do with it? It's being used to stabilize and to close these rubbish tips, and even in so-called sanitary landfills, the leachate collection systems. What do you do with the leachate? That's highly toxic stuff, nasty. Wetlands. In China, they planted vetiver all over these massive dumps, and the leachate coming out now is, I wouldn't drink it, but it looks a whole heck of a lot better and doesn't smell bad. In disaster mitigation, which I think that's the heart of, for me, of climate change adaptation, because it's the extreme events that are really costing us. And so for disaster mitigation, things like riverbank stabilization, landslide prevention, watershed protection, protecting your water supplies in hilly areas, all of these things are becoming increasingly important. And of course, there's always farmers want other uses. They don't just want what you think they want or that they need, soil conservation. Handicrafts has, in a number of countries, become quite a business. And of course, the more demand there is for vetiver, the more things like small-scale household nurseries become income-generating opportunities to feed into programs. So what you can do with vetiver is a very broad menu of effective applications that, in the aggregate, function as a toolkit. And we think that to disseminate and scale up the use, be more effective to promote it as a toolkit with a wide range of uses, rather than keeping it siloed amongst maybe just one small group with one particular interest, because it does have so many advantages and potential opportunities that we would just like to get out there. We're not saying that people should use it. We're saying take a look at it. Give it a try. Anyway, principal disadvantages of vetiver: it's a very bulky technology since it's clonal propagation. So if you want to use it at scale, you're going to have to introduce it. You're going to require timely access to large quantities of material, so you need to sort of think that through. Vetiver is not shade tolerant. That's a problem in some places, not a problem in others. Give you an example. There's a lot of concern, why are we using this exotic plant instead of a native plant to rehabilitate or to restore or to stabilize this area? Well, because oftentimes the native plants can't get started under those degraded conditions. Stabilize the site with a vetiver, the natives come in, they shade it out, it disappears. Job done. So hedgerow establishment, you need to make sure, it's a plant, it needs water to grow. So when you're establishing it, you got to make sure that it can get its roots in and get established. So in arid and semi-arid conditions, that really requires having modest, well organized approaches to establishment. And in those areas also, it can take 2 to 3 years for a dense hedgerow to grow. Free grazing animals, only a problem during establishment, but it can tolerate direct grazing once established. Maintenance might require weeding during establishment phase. Should be pruned to keep the health of the hedge up and to keep the center of it, because you can shade the center out of the clump. Fortunately, in the tropics with vertical sunlight, that's not as much of a problem. But the thing about maintenance is it provides benefits. There's your fodder, there's mulch, and the mulch from vetiver is excellent, lasts a long time. And I think I showed you a thatching has become quite popular, because that vetiver thatch will last years longer than most other thatch grasses. And the really good thatches, palms and things, are becoming so scarce and hard to find. So that's it. Thank you very much. I hope I've piqued your interest. Tried to cover a lot of territory in very few minutes, but there's our website, and there's probably much more than you want to know about vetiver available at that website. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you for following directions and staying where you are.
Okay.
That's great. So we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. We have, like I said, some plants that are going to use the hoover. Oh, sad, womp womp. Plant pun. That's for you, Barry. Some people are going to ask hoover questions and get those from the app. But also, if you have a question you'd like to raise your hand, we have roving microphones. Back in the back, David, thank you. Over here, maybe we'll start with Tyler.
Hello, I did not see, but maybe vetiver is being used for fire breaks or things like that. Can you make any comments on that because of its water holding capacity in dry seasons?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we first ran into that application in South Africa in the forest plantations. They were putting vetiver in as fire breaks, and then they were burning it off at the end of the wet season in order to get a flush of green growth on it. So going into the dry season, it was a nice wet hedge and worked as a fire break. I have not seen it used in smallholder agriculture as a fire break, because generally we try to get them to quit burning and leave the crop residues there and things. But yes, it can be used as a fire break.
Right. This side?
Okay. Quick question here on, have you seen anybody slashing back a vetiver, say, to use for filling in on a road rut or something like that? Because I know they tell me in South Sudan that people used to fix their own roads by putting clumps of grass or something like that. You know, you have the roots. I don't know if you want to cut into the root system or not, but you could at least cut some of the material, fix a rut in a road. Might seem to be a really good way to improve a road and keep it. Another question is, have you seen anybody like that? I like that picture of the mulched area with the vetiver on both sides and the trees, but seems like it needs some legumes in there, some perennial herbaceous legumes or something maybe a tree legume that you slash back so it doesn't shade out the vetiver, but that could be a great addition maybe to the system. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah. So on the first one, once farmers have vetiver, and once vetiver's there, whether it's the hedge in their field or whether it's a cut bank that's being stabilized, you can go and actually sort of just cut that clump in half and dig some of it out. So it becomes its own means of propagation. So yes, formal nurseries are good, whether those be at a small scale at a household or whether it be larger scale. But the existing material you can cut into those roots. You can take out half the hedge and use it to extend it or to take it someplace else. So those informal nurseries work really well. And that's how I stabilize my creek bank in Texas. Is whenever I need more vetiver, I just go cut into the big clumps that are already there along the creek bank. On your second point, soil health, soil nutrition, fertility is so critical, and I mean that's really what we're after with this is soil health. And vetiver is not a magic bullet. It's a part of it needs to be part of a whole farming system. And so, I agree with you completely, but I guess we're limited by our name. We're the Vetiver Network International, so we try to stay in our lane, as one of the speakers was saying last night. But yes, there is no doubt about that getting legumes are one way to do it. Crop residue management is another way. Livestock management. The Chinese have fantastic rule of thumb systems that developed over the centuries of how many pigs you need for a moo of rice and how much crop residue. And they've sustained agriculture for. Is everybody familiar with a book called Farmers of 40 Centuries? What a fantastic book. I really recommend everybody to read that. But it's all about getting organic matter into the soil.
Okay, Daniel, thank you for the joke. Just a question, how far north can you plant it?
Okay, we say rule of thumb, continental situation, 30 degrees north. Now, south of the equator, you can go farther than that. But unless you're in a coastal zone or in a Mediterranean climate. So vetiver is used up into northern Italy in some of the coastal areas. In Spain, it's in northern Spain and up with some of the wine country up there. California, above 30 degrees. My vetiver is at sort of 29 degrees, 58 minutes. And it survived the big freeze that we had 9-degree Fahrenheit weather and high winds, and it was below freezing for almost 60 hours. I didn't lose any established vetiver, but that was probably because snow fell on it and insulated the ground.
Right, this one.
Yeah. Is vetiver known by that name everywhere, or are there other names that we might encounter?
There's lots of other names out
there on their website?
Out there. In India, it's cussgrass is well known. In Central America, you'll find names like Zacate valeriana, because the tea is used as a nerve calming, so like valerian. And actually we do have sort of a list of other names on our website that you can find, but there's a large diversity of names.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. Actually, it was something that I personally was thinking about, how can we encourage people in our area to, start raising vetiver. It has a lot of several advantages, like it's protect the land from erosion. You can use the leaves to cover the ground, and it can be used to feed animals. One of my questions is, does it interfere with the process of growing if animals eat the leaves while they are young, or the plant is young?
Mm-hmm.
So does that interfere, prevent it from growing normally or from developing?
Yeah, yeah. The of course it's that answer is going to vary a little bit on how rapidly the vetiver is growing. So you get into the semi-arid areas where it takes longer for it to get in a good root system to anchor it, then animals can yank it out of the ground when they're grazing on it. But once that root system is in and they can't yank it out, they can still trample it, and that will retard its growth. But really, once you've got an established hedge, you can free graze animals on it, and it will not impact its effectiveness, because the really dense portion of the hedgerow down close to the ground has got older material in it. And I said, I've seen goats tethered to clumps of vetiver. They can't actually get their muzzle down into it. You know, it's a physical barrier to get at the green shoots that are, you know, sort of tender that they want, that are growing up lower in the. And I think you mentioned that you grazed a donkey for 4 months on it.
Is there any basic, simple ways we can process it? I mean, it's the roots that's mostly, you know, provide the financial aspect of it. It's the root system. Is there any simple ways that we can process it actually? Like, they grow vetiver a lot in the southern part of Haiti. They have some refinery there. I haven't had time to visit them yet. Mm-hmm. But people like to see how it's going to be helpful to me. I want to do something that will help me put food on the table and feed my family and put money in my pocket. So
yeah, no, and that is,
you have to go a lot to make money in Haiti, from what I understand. So if we can find a way to process it, mm-hmm. would that be helpful? Is there any simple techniques that
well, of course, in Haiti, you are the center of vetiver oil production for some of the high-end perfumes, Chanel No. 5 and others. And those companies will only buy vetiver oil from established traders, and those established traders will only buy vetiver oil from established known farmers. So that aromatic oil, that essential oil market is pretty much captured and inelastic. It's not growing. The aromatherapy market has opened up more market for vetiver oil, and I know in Haiti there are a number of efforts to work with small farmers for artisanal scale distillation for sale into the aromatherapy market. The idea being that, well, leave hedges there and harvest the plants between the hedges to control the erosion. But having said that, that's one of the reasons why we think it's important to sort of promote the broader uses of the plant, because when you look, there was an interesting paper done in Nigeria where they went out where farmers, about half of the households were using vetiver, and they asked them, why are you using vetiver? And of course the answers were different for men than they were for women, but soil conservation was sort of their fifth reason. It was fodder, it was mulch, it was pest control, it was in some cases handicrafts, or its use for thatching and for these other uses, which is why I think, you know, my approach to dissemination and promotion is a slow one. I think, you know, something I've heard from everybody here, and we all know Roland Bunch and his 2 ears of corn. I had a opportunity to spend a week with Roland and his extensionists in Honduras back 30 years ago, and I was just very impressed about their understanding of the intentionality of, let's experiment a little bit here, let's try it out. If you like it, let's see how you adapt it. What other uses might it have? Does this work for you or not? I mean, that people-centered extension that Roland put a name on, I think that's the way to go, and that's the way I would introduce vetiver. Let people know that it's there, let people know it's got a broad range of uses, help them explore those uses through their felt needs, and they'll hopefully find, as these households in Nigeria did, that there's other benefits beyond the soil and moisture conservation. We think soil and moisture conservation, we know soil and moisture conservation is incredibly important, but our clients and colleagues that do the actual farming don't necessarily agree with us.
We have a question from the Hoover app. Does Vetiver work in higher saline conditions, for example, seashore? Has any studies been done on that?
Yes, it's actually incredibly salt tolerant. There's some great pictures from Brazil where resorts are using vetiver to stabilize the beaches. You're not going to establish it in standing salt water, but once it's established, it has a very, very high saline tolerance at levels that are toxic to most plants. It's not a halophyte by any means, but it does have a very good tolerance to saline conditions.
Can I ask one more from Hoover? I don't know if there's been studies done on this, but what is the minimum distance from trees that vetiver can be planted that the roots do not inhibit the growth of the young trees?
Mm-hmm. Good question. As I mentioned, in Vietnam right now, the Vietnam farmers group they're planting them right at the base of fruit trees. They're actually doing a circle. They use the mulch. They see the additional recharge around it. They're reporting for the fruit trees that they're growing that you can bang it right up against the tree and see some benefits from it. Obviously, there's always an issue of root and nutrient competition. Vetiver roots are very vertical. They're not, and many of the grasses that are used, like the pennisetums and things, they tend to have a root system that grows out and is more shallow, so you've got to keep plowing next to it to break those roots up. Vetiver roots tend to be more vertical, which is one reason why they seem to have lower levels of competition. Now, in annual crops, grain crops, you'll oftentimes see that first row banged up against the hedge. You will see competition effects. What we say is that through the soil and moisture conservation and managing your soil, you're going to get increased production. It will more than make up for reduced production in the one row. Young trees, I really don't know the answer to that. I would encourage you to experiment and find out. It could be beneficial. It could be that there is. It's going to depend on the species, the slope, the aspect. Is it a south-facing slope? Is it a north-facing slope? I think there's, it's the fun of this business is you get to experiment.
And share back with the network.
Exactly.
And
Please
share
do.
So what are your suggestions for how to start using vetiver? Maybe a small-scale farmer or a small project?
Yes, well, I think like anything else, it's you have to work through the felt needs of the people that you're working with. So, in your dialogue and you have an engagement with them. You hear them saying, I've got this problem, or I've got that problem, or what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about that? If there's your entree. If vetiver would be a solution, well, this is one we can try. Let's get some. Who wants to help bulk up so we have enough to do the experiment with? But yeah, to me the entree is always through what the people you're working with, what their felt needs are, and what they identify as necessary.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, one thing that generally is always a good one is if your access roads are coming apart during the rainy season, you can say, hey, would you like to stabilize the road? That's a good place to start, and then it creates a lot of material. I'm just going to say one last thing very quickly. We have set up a page on iNaturalist called the Vetiver Project. I don't know if you're familiar with iNaturalist, but the idea is for end users to geo-reference their uses and say briefly, sort of why you planted this. because we think this is really going to be important for other people that want to try it. If they can get on iNaturalist and say, oh, well, there's somebody, a kilometer down the road that actually has experience, they don't have to figure out how to write to the Vetiver Network. They can just walk the kilometer down the road. So would encourage you, if you've got installations, please put them up on iNaturalist, because we think it's a great promotional tool. Okay, thank you.
So cut grass, it sounds like very important for the human consumption, but at the same thing, but also it sounds like it requires a lot of water. And my question will be more, what will you say for a tropical area or places with a lack of water, and then people actually willing to expand that plantation? What is your suggestions on that?
Okay, so in the semi-arid areas of India, so we're down in the, say, 600 millimeter, 700 millimeter range of annual rainfall, that generally all of it falls in 2 to 3 months, and then you have a very strong 9-month dry season after that. You can get vetiver established with rainfall on that. You don't need irrigation to do that. It's just the timing of your planting has to be good. You've got to get it in early in the rainy season. You need good quality, healthy plants. You need to plant them right. You need to get them in at the right time. And that's one of the biggest mistakes that people make when they have too little planting material. They'll spread it out too far apart because they want to cover a longer area, and they'll keep planting into, when they shouldn't be planting anymore because the rains are going to be stopping. Much better to sort of do it securely, a little bit at a time, what you can do. And we've had vetiver established down to 200, 250 millimeters rainfall, but that's been with subsoiling and what we call contour V ditches that, sort of, you need a bulldozer for those.
Hi. I was wondering if you have any experience with vetiver mitigating the persistent herbicides that might be in soils, and if you could comment on that.
Yeah, vetiver does not get along with glyphosate. So if you want to kill vetiver, hit it with Roundup, with glyphosate. But some of the other herbicides, and this is something that actually the ties and some others are working on right now, working on atrazine and working on some of the, dioxins can be a breakdown product of some agrochemicals as well. So yeah, there's a body of literature out there. If you're not familiar with the with Google Scholar, that's a great way to find research. And also ResearchGate. A lot of authors post their papers there. They're behind a paywall. You want to pay $120 to read my paper, go through Wiley Press, or I put it up on ResearchGate, and you can have it for free. I've generally found that most good things behind paywalls, with a little patience, you can find a free copy of it somewhere on the internet.
So ideally we could get it from someone locally, a neighbor, the 1 kilometer you talked about. If it's not there and you have to go to the capital city or a neighboring, country, how well do the slips travel?
Oh, they travel very well. If they're packaged right, if you can get quality planting material, they can be wrapped up and sent through the mail and spend a month or more getting there, and they'll still be good for the most part. If it lasts a month, 6 weeks, you're not going to have 100% viable slips, but a couple weeks, not a problem.
Great.
And then when you get them, just throw them in a pail of water and let them float around in the water for a week or 2 until they start putting on new roots.
There you go. Yes.
Hi, I was curious how deeply into the root system you need to dig when you want to propagate a clump.
Good question.
Not at all. So there's what we call the crown of the plant. Well, here, there's vetiver right here. So I was remiss not to mention it. But when you look at it, you'll see that the tillers themselves, that have sort of a keeled shape to them. They're not round, they're keeled. That those are attached to the crown of the plant, and basically that's all you need to take off. You don't actually need roots. Roots are handy when you're planting them just because it provides some physical anchoring of it. But it's going to replace those roots because you've handled them and they've been exposed to the air. Or unless you throw them in a bucket of water and you're planting straight out of the bucket of water when it's got viable roots and you don't touch them. But yeah, you don't need any root at all. But 5-10 centimeters is useful for helping to anchor it when you compact the earth back around it again.
Great question.
One last question.
Yes, one last question.
Okay, thanks.
I just wanted to share that Vetiver is on the farm on the east side of the global farm, and on the mountain. I have a question about fertilizer, but I was just going to share. You are also looking at Vetiver in the front on the edges of the planter boxes. But yeah, with the mountain, I planted some Vetiver at the top as well, and I realized it's shade tolerant, very much so, because they were not taking off. And then after the hurricane blew over all the trees, they are actually doing a lot better. So I'm hoping that they will take off, and then later on they'll be established enough when the trees grow back. But do you have any recommendations for fertilizer? I was reading online that they do like fertilizer.
Yeah, it's pretty good at scavenging nutrients itself, but you know it is a plant, and depending on the soil conditions you put it into. Animal manures are probably the best fertilizer. Pig manure is probably the best of all the best because a little bit of pee to help kick it off and get it started. You'll find a really good reference on our website by Dr. P.K. Yoon called A Look-See at Vetiver. He was the head of the Rubber Research Institute in Malaysia, got interested in Vetiver, and in 2 years he did more research on that plant, you know, sort of from an operational point of view, you know, exactly how much fertilizer should you be using if you want to optimize growth. So that's all in there. But yes, plants like nutrients, so if you give it some additional ones, it will say thank you.